Hey, Sustainable Asia listeners. In our last episode, we partnered with Break Free from Plastic, or BFFP, because we wanted to feature NGO advocates in Asia who are involved in the treaty negotiations to get their perspectives on the process. In this episode, we're back partnering with BFFP again, but this time honing in on one of the big open questions coming up at the INC-4 talks: how the treaty should deal with problematic plastics and chemicals of concern. With time short to negotiate a final treaty, Switzerland has called for an initial list of problematic plastics to be worked out by year-end 2024. With this exciting proposal at hand, we want to take a step back and give some background to chemicals of concern in plastic for consumers and advocates alike. At the end of this episode, we'll revisit how these problematic plastics can be regulated both in and out of the treaty. So first, we're going to chat with BFFP member Madhuvanti Rajkumar, a lawyer by training. She holds a master's degree in public international law. She's currently working as a researcher in environment and climate action and solid waste management at Citizen Consumer and Civic Action Group, or CAG, in India. And she represents CAG at the Global Plastics Treaty meetings. I started our conversation by asking Madhuvante about her background.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you, Sustainable Asia, for inviting me to be on this podcast. I am Madhuvanti. The reason why I subsequently into the nonprofit or the social impact sector is because I realized that I have been privileged enough to be born into a comfortable family and have a comfortable life. And I wanted to use that privilege to lend my voice for the voiceless. So, with that, I was introduced to the field. And for the last 4 years, I've been working in public policy, including international relations, solid waste management, and hazardous chemicals management.
It's a super interesting kind of spin on different NGOs across Asia, right? There are certain ones that focus on banning toxics in waste and always been a focus on the downstream of the waste management, but just viewing it from the perspective of everyday people who are buying and using these plastics must bring you a lot of insight.
Definitely, because one of the most common narratives that we hear at the negotiations is that the industry always, and most often the governments also, always blame the reason for plastic pollution on consumers.
Right.
They say consumers are polluters because they litter.
Right.
And consumers are defenseless at that point. So you need someone there.
Right. And also, consumers want a firmer plastic. They want certain characteristic of the plastic packaging, correct?
Yeah, I
Which
think
brings us back to the chemicals, definitely.
exactly. So we believe that the non-biodegradability or the single-use culture or microplastics are the issues with plastic. But chemicals in plastics is a whole other issue, and that is in fact an invisible killer. To make plastics what they are, to make them functional, to give them shape. When plastics came out, we were thinking, oh wow, what a wondrous material we have. We can carry liquids in it,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
comes in so many different colors and shapes. But we
Right.
had no idea about the millions, thousands of chemicals that go in to make plastics what they are.
So maybe you could give us an example of that, because you did that wonderful blog on microwaving plastics. Oh, put your food in the microwave and heat it up in this plastic. But there's a lot of dangers behind that, right?
100%. The blog that you're talking about was about, I'd written it on whether microwave safe containers are truly safe and can you trust the label to mean it's safe for your health. So we already have enough standards on labeling. So labeling is something extremely important, especially from a consumer point of view, because that is their right to access to information can be fulfilled only through labels from producers. Just to very in a nutshell, to quickly explain this, we know that plastics are poor conductors of heat, but that doesn't mean they're absolutely immune to heat. Because when you expose plastics to high temperatures for a long time, and even if it's sunlight, plastics can alter shape and form. So, what happens is when you expose it to heat, the bonds in a plastic product is broken down.
Mm.
And when the bonds are broken down, the thousands of chemicals and additives that are added to give it all its unique and wondrous properties, they are released. And when they're released, what do? They leach into whatever substance you've stored in your plastic container. So, this is what happens essentially when you use a plastic container in the microwave. And
Right.
why is it a problem is because, again, I'm sure this has been addressed before, but two of the most common chemicals which are added to many plastic products are BPA and phthalates. And BPA is added to make plastics harder, whereas phthalates are added to make it flexible and durable. These two chemicals are very well known to be endocrine disrupting chemicals, and they've been associated with a wide range of impacts such as infertility, thyroid diseases, cancer, heart attacks, strokes. Even we see a lot of early puberty cases, and we see a lot of it's very surprising.
I mean, at least you do see the term BPA free quite a bit.
Right.
Now, Talads, what would be an example of something that people would recognize with that?
So anything. So for example, everything, even food packaging or food consumer goods, were made using BPA and phthalates earlier. In the 1960s, BPA was a very commonly used component in food packaging. This BPA was even used in baby bottles, in making baby bottles.
Mhm.
And if I'm not wrong, it's 1960s. There was a lot of protest and a lot of anger from the people, from the civil society about the industry's use of BPA, such hazardous chemical in something as important as a baby bottle where a child gets its nutrition from. Since then, they stopped using BPA in some products. However, as you rightly pointed out, many products these days are advertised to be BPA free. But there's a catch. This doesn't mean it's safe. It just means it's BPA free. Because if you are removing BPA, which is what is required to make a plastic harder, it means that you need to substitute other chemicals to give it the same property. So
Mhm.
instead of BPA, they would add BPS or BPF.
Mm.
And another thing is that just because something is BPA free doesn't mean it's phthalate free. Phthalates are also known to be endocrine disrupting chemicals, which cause all of the health issues that I mentioned earlier.
And that includes cooking surfaces, correct? So not just your water bottles and
No,
the
it's also your non-stick pan. It's also your container, the packaging in the grocery. So the most commonly used plastics for food packaging are styrene from polystyrene, and PVC is another common and
yeah,
very
that's a
very
bad one.
hazardous.
Right.
Yeah, and polyethylene, and even this acetaldehyde from PET is
Okay.
also, yeah.
But how do you think that the kind of research you were just discussing and also the advocacy that we saw behind the BPA can then translate into getting more traction on these chemicals?
What I would say the problem specifically with packaging is that it is single use, it is excessive, and in most cases it was non-essential. I would just like to give one example to sort of highlight the how prevalent the issue of chemicals in plastic packaging is by giving an example in India.
Oh, great.
So in India, I'm not sure if you've heard of this, we have a lot of tea shops. Tea shops are something, it's like a neighborhood shop, which you find every 50 meters everywhere in India. And people go there to have a glass of tea or coffee. And earlier, these hot beverages used to be served in glass tumblers, and they used to be washed in hot water and then served reused again. India actually has a very traditionally sustainable culture. But nowadays, as consumers, we've been trained to see that anything wrapped in plastic is hygienic, anything wrapped in plastic is safe. So nowadays, they started giving tea or coffee in a what they call a paper cup, but paper can't hold liquid, so they obviously line it with plastic. So imagine you're drinking your hot tea from a plastic cup, and the temperature is it just melts all the bonds, and it's directly leaching into your tea, and you're drinking your tea every day. And what is worse is if someone wants to take away like a cup of tea or coffee, the boiling hot tea or coffee is packed in a very thin plastic bag or pouch. And people consume this every single day without even realizing that
Mhm.
they are poisoning themselves.
I know the people that have been impacted have been the less advantaged in certainly in South and Southeast Asia. Thank you so much, Madhuvanti, for all of your efforts and for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I hope I was able to answer the questions.
Oh, you were very well. And it was nice to have the consumer perspective for sure.
Definitely.
So that was an interesting discussion of chemicals like BPA and BPF that are added to single use plastic packaging to make them more useful to consumers. But what about forever plastics or PFAS? What are those chemicals and how are they used? I talked to BFFP member Jam Lorenzo of Philippine based band Toxics, where he's policy development and research head. Before diving into the PFAS question, I asked him to introduce himself first.
So I'm Jam Lorenzo. I work for Band Toxics. We are a Philippine-based non-government organization. We work on chemicals and waste issues. So I've been working for Band Toxics for maybe 8 years now, and I'm in Manila currently.
What part of Manila?
I'm in Quezon City right now.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's crowded.
Yeah, and dogs everywhere.
Well, why don't we start the conversation, though, with this a little bit more serious gravity discussion of toxics in plastics and our human health would probably be helpful as maybe to just get back to, forever plastics or PFAS and maybe explaining in simple terms what that is and what you've seen as some of the impacts on the natural environment and human health.
Okay, so PFAS, or what we call in the Philippines PFAS, I'm not sure if it's a term used. PFAS is a forever chemical. It's considered a forever chemical because it is nearly indestructible. It's also a part of a group of chemicals called persistent organic pollutants. These persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, are called as such because of a few characteristics. One is they persist in the environment for long periods of time, so they stay where they are. They bioaccumulate and biomagnify. What that means is they accumulate in one species and they are passed on through the food chain. And persistent organic pollutants also have the capacity to travel long distances. So even if they are emitted in maybe the Philippines, it could even reach farther countries or other countries
Mm.
because of its characteristics. So PFAS is also, aside from being a persistent organic pollutant, it's also called an endocrine disrupting chemical. So it disrupts our metabolism, it impacts our immune systems, liver, thyroid function, affects puberty, and is a cause for cancer. So, and PFAS is used in a variety of everyday products. So it's used in food packaging or cookware to prevent food from sticking. It's used in clothing to improve resistance to stains. It's used as a firefighting foam, and it's even used in cosmetics. So PFAS is everywhere.
Wow, that's super interesting. And are there any bans currently in the Philippines on PFAS?
In the Philippines, we have something called the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. So it's a global treaty that monitors and regulates POPs, or persistent organic pollutants, right? So under the Stockholm Convention, we have the convention text has provisions to eliminate and restrict three kinds of PFAS, which is PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS. So three kinds of POPs are mentioned in the convention. However, there are like thousands of chemicals and of chemical compounds of PFAS. So there's a lot of more work to do.
You're just
Uh,
scratching the surface, are you?
yeah, we're
Mm.
just scratching the surface. So the Stockholm Convention was ratified in the Philippines in 2004. So effectively,
That's
what's written
great.
in the convention is also banned in the Philippines.
Right.
However, if we look at policies specific to the Philippines, we have what we call the Philippine Inventory of Chemicals and Chemical Substances, which is just basically a list of chemicals, right? So it has PFAS. Some PFAS chemicals are listed under it, but we have no specific policies that regulate the chemicals. And PFAS is not even mentioned in our list of banned, restricted, severely restricted, and regulated chemicals.
Hmm.
So that's the landscape so far. in the
Right.
Philippines.
Well, at least they've adopted the Stockholm Convention. That's great news, right? And what have been your comments then regarding the zero draft now that it's bigger and more amorphous and we're going to INC-4? Is there any news on attacking PFAS there?
Yeah, so what we've always been calling for, and this is a very, very quick summary because it would take very long for us to list list out everything. Okay.
Thank you for
So what
sparing me for that.
we really want is to push for options that call for the elimination rather than the minimization or reduction of chemicals of concern.
Mm.
That's the end goal.
I see. So, which is a harder sell, of course, than just setting minimums and maximums, right, for
Yeah.
corporations. And how would you envision the elimination being implemented? Because we both know that plastic packaging does not have contents. We don't know what's in that plastic packaging, right? So, how
Yeah.
would you envision then putting that elimination taking place?
You know, when we talk about elimination, it really starts with ensuring first and foremost that there's transparency and traceability within the plastics value chain, you know. So what we talk when we talk about transparency and traceability is we're just really just talking about making information available. And the thing is, if we make all of these things, all of these information available to the public, to governments, for example, then we can ensure that they can have informed decision making.
That's
So,
right.
and I personally, I don't think we can have everything we want reflected in the treaty. So it's important to actually push for these neutral concepts such as transparency and traceability, and just strategize about how we can mobilize maybe the public and governments to start addressing issues that won't be addressed in the treaty.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that if reporting and monitoring is that transparency on the value chain is really important, and we've seen it in other sectors, right?
Yeah.
We've seen it in water, air pollution, et cetera. As soon as you put out what the contents are and consumers realize what they're putting in their microwave oven or what they're putting in their refrigerator, then changes start to happen. So, can you dig a little deeper on that one? So, let's just say that we got lucky and kind of like the climate change agreements, which created the IPCC, which created this, scientific group finally that started measuring temperatures and giving us really
Yeah.
specific data about climate change. How would reporting and monitoring requirements, how would that kind of really happen then if a treaty signed it?
Okay. So I think first and foremost, monitoring and reporting, they both promote accountability. Accountability for, parties, accountability for those who are implementing the treaty. One thing that I would like to highlight is we need consistent monitoring and reporting formats because, this has been an issue in a lot of, not only with the plastics treaty, but in other MEAs, where something as trivial as, requiring or not requiring strict formatting for national reports, this could lead eventually to loopholes, with some countries maybe hiding data or information. And lastly, we need to make sure that this information is publicly available. Based on my experience, in other MEAs, we've had problems with national reports only being available to a select few people or to the secretariat of certain conventions. So I think accessibility of information for the public ensures accountability.
So hopefully we'll add to the research out there on the chemicals impact on our human health, right?
Yeah, yeah. Additionally, aside from the consistent monitoring and reporting formats, because like I said earlier, what's most important is the kind of information that we're monitoring and reporting actually, right? So what we need is a globally harmonized labeling system, I think, to identify problematic chemicals and products. And this allows everyone to, maybe follow certain guidelines, follow the same set of rules so that data becomes a lot more usable. And finally, after that, this can the whole
Is
chain,
right, the full jam wish list.
the full my full wish list for only for monitoring and reporting. Okay, my full wish list is after this that we have a strong knowledge management and awareness raising program. because we need to ensure that the information regarding chemicals are provided to parties and to consumers. Because if you're a lawmaker, you just read about something like PFAS and you don't know what it is, then you can't really make these decisions, right? So it's important that information regarding what these chemicals are and how they impact the environment and health are provided to those who are making their decisions. And like I said earlier, this can have informed decision making for both parties and the consumers.
Hmm. Reporting and transparency in plastic packaging protects the consumer, so why wouldn't industry want to provide that? Understanding what the ingredients in plastic packaging also helps build the body of research needed for regulators and scientists to determine if any ingredients are toxic to human health. Again, why wouldn't it make sense to also provide that information to the public? To follow on this conversation, I turn to BFFP member Jorge Emanuel, adjunct professor of environmental science and of engineering at Silliman University in the Philippines. Jorge actually has a long history of working first in the plastics industry, and now he's applying his knowledge to this issue of toxins in plastics. He's also an official member of the Philippine Treaty Delegation. Jorge talked to us from his farm near Silliman University on Negros Island in southern Philippines.
Hello, Marcy. My name is Jorge Emanuel, and I am a professor at Silliman University in the Philippines. And I'm recording from my house, which is at the foot of a mountain in a rural area in the Philippines, where
Oh, lovely.
I'm surrounded by trees and my dogs and my cats.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Maybe I'll get on a plane and join you.
You're welcome.
Well, despite that peaceful serenity, I'm going to interrupt it with a little bit of questions about plastics and toxins and how they impact our health. And hopefully, your farm there is situated you where you don't have to worry about that.
I wish that were the case, but it's not true.
It's everywhere, right?
It's everywhere. Even though I'm out here far from the big cities, we are all affected by plastics. And so the research work I've been doing at the university has been looking at our fish, our seafood, our clams, oysters, where we're finding microplastics in all of them. And so, despite my wanting to live a environmentally friendly life with nature, I still end up getting plastics just from the food I eat. We're finding it in vegetables and fruit. So no matter where you are, you're affected by the problem of plastic pollution.
Tell me more about your research and where you feel as though the state of plastic toxins and human health are.
Yes, things I've been focusing for the last number of years is the chemicals found in plastics. Now, the most recent study that came out was by the Norwegian Research Council. And what they found was not surprising to me. There are more than 16,000 chemicals added to plastics in its process of manufacturing. And out of this, we know that 4,200 of those chemicals have hazardous properties. But we also know that the bulk of them, more than 10,000, have no hazardous data or have not been tested at all.
So, of the chemicals that we do understand, of the ones that there have been research on, would you be able to pick three toxins in plastics that are a priority for you in the Global Plastics Treaty?
Uh, yes, actually, in the work I've been doing with other colleagues, we have identified at least 15 groups of chemicals that are of very high concern to us, that are among the chemicals being used in plastics. Some of them you might know if you keep up with the news articles about this. For example, there are what we call the PFASs, or the forever chemicals
Right.
that are being used in plastics. There are PCBs. There are a whole group of chemicals called the phthalates. And these phthalates we know are endocrine disruptors. There are PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, some of which cause cancer. So there's a range of these. And the problem is when we look at them, our concerns are that these are chemicals that either cause cancer, cause mutagens, are toxic to the reproductive system, have specific target organ toxicities. That means they attack the kidney or the liver, and are endocrine disruptors or a combination of these. And we feel many of these need to be banned, eliminated as soon as possible.
Do you think that the industry does not want to do it because, A, once you know what's in it, then it might get banned, or B, because it's just difficult for each batch that they produce? They don't want to have to create an ingredient list.
It might be a combination of all that. And, a lot is they're trying to protect trade secrets. That's going to be an issue because some produce specialty plastics, which with special features, and maybe they want to protect what they put in there. But for the vast majority of commodity plastics, as we call them, the plastics are very common. They're all very similar, but we need to know what's in there. If there is a globally harmonized system where we have reporting, we can study what are the dangerous chemicals, what are the chemicals that would be acceptable to certain levels, then it would push the industry to innovate and come up with materials that are safer for people. The reason I said earlier that I wasn't surprised with the Norwegian Research Council report is because I had published with a number of other authors where we were looking at food contact plastics, food grade plastics. And when I first got into it, I was quite shocked to see that we're adding about 12,000 chemicals in food contact plastics, plastics intended to hold food.
Right.
Many of these chemicals have no hazard properties. They have never been tested, and yet they've been approved. So it shows some of the flaws in the food safety regulations that
Right.
exist around the world. So we need to improve on that.
So is there anywhere around the world, like any country that's already doing this, even outside of the UN Plastics Treaty?
Yes, actually, from the work I've been doing, it seems like the European Union and the Europeans are far ahead compared to other parts of the world in moving this issue. They are very familiar with many of these chemicals, and although it's always a struggle, but they're
Yeah, because they're changing all the time, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that they come up with some ways of dealing with the issue that I think could be good models for what we can do internationally. We have also been looking at the international conventions, and out of the 16,000 chemicals, about 980 are actually regulated under either the Stockholm Convention, the Basel Convention, Minamata Convention, and the Montreal Convention. Those four. And you can add a few more under the Rotterdam Convention. So what we're saying, what many of us are arguing, is for those chemicals that are already globally regulated. In the case of the Stockholm Convention, these are the worst of the persistent organic pollutants. Let's begin with that and eliminate those from plastics. And then let's go to the rest, the additional 4,200 that we know are hazardous, and begin to phase them out. Give some time period, but at some point they need to be eliminated. And then let's deal with the 10,000 for which we have no data. We need to work on that as well. So this is going to be work that I think will happen for several decades. But if we don't do it now, then this problem will never be solved on the issue of toxins and toxic chemicals in plastic.
The Swiss government recently floated a conceptual framework that calls for the initial list of problematic plastics to be worked out at the last negotiating session of the plastics treaty at year end, and then developing a list of chemicals concern, which would be for the first conference of party meetings. That's all very technical treaty language, but can you
Yes.
explain how that could unfold?
Yes, actually, what the Swiss government did was very good. What they did is they put together this draft input paper, as they called it. It was a conceptual paper, but it was more than that because in it they actually gave examples of possible treaty language and even came up with an initial list of the problematic plastics, for example, that they felt should be eliminated within a certain number of years, say after the treaty comes into force, for example. And they called a meeting last March 18 and 19. They invited countries around the world to bring their experts, and I was among those that was invited.
Oh, great.
And so we met for 2 days and we discussed all that. And I thought it was a very good meeting. I thought we moved the discussion forward. And basically, what we did at the meeting was to discuss how can we come up with very clear criteria and some quantifiable measures so that we can use scientific evidence to determine which are the ones that are problematic. So, although they had come up with a list, I think there was an original list of about 10 or so, we suggested adding a few more. But all of these would need to go through a rigorous analysis by an independent team of scientists. I have to emphasize independent team of scientists because we felt we couldn't have scientists with a conflict of interest to be part of making such a decision. They have to be scientists that have the interest of public health and the interest of the public at heart, rather the interest of maybe some industry or people paying them who have some financial vested interest to keep something out of that list. But if an independent scientist can do this rigorously, we can come up with a list. And the initial list was good and thought provoking, but I also felt we needed to put this through a sort of rigorous analysis. And they did attempt to put in explanations of why each were important, but we need to do more. But that's where I felt it had moved the discussion further. And we hope that at this coming governmental negotiating committee in Canada in April, that this could be picked up and made into a formal, we call it intersessional work, which means work between the negotiating committee meetings in which the details of this are worked out by the different countries. What happened in Switzerland was referred to as an informal work
Right.
session.
Because they
And the
weren't
reason,
allowing intersessional work, right? After
exactly,
INC-3, it was so
exactly.
frustrating.
That was
Yeah.
very frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, so important. And back to your point about the scientists, right? Because I know you were one of the signatories to the scientist declaration on the need for governance of plastic throughout their life cycles. That issue of how you're bringing the scientist view into the discussions at the Global Plastics Treaty is really critical.
Yes, I think people are beginning to realize more and more that science has to have an integral part in this treaty. One of the most successful environmental treaties we have is the Montreal Protocol, where we have succeeded actually in eliminating most of the worst ozone depleting chemicals. These are the chemicals that
Right.
slowly go up into the ozone layer and give us the ozone hole. That succeeded because they made use of science. They had a science policy body that brought in the science, and the treaty was written to be flexible and dynamic. As the science brought in new evidence, what the Montreal Protocol did is they added more chemicals, they speeded up the phase out of other chemicals when it became clear that these were really bad. We need to do the same with the plastics treaty. We need to have a flexible treaty that has science behind it, so it's science based and it has independent scientists being able to provide the best available science for people to make decisions and for the treaty to then be able to adapt to it.
Hey, Sustainable Asia listeners. I'm Marcy Trent Long, and this episode was produced by Carol Meng in Hong Kong. Thanks to our guests, Raduvanti Rajkumar at Citizen Consumer and Civic Action Group, or CAG in India, Jam Lorenzo of Philippine-based band Toxics, and Jorge Emanuel, Institute of Environmental and Marine Sciences and the College of Engineering and Design at Silliman University in Dumaguete, Philippines. Check out the show notes for links to reports and research from our guests and from BFFP. Alexander Mobison created the intro-outro music made by repurposed and recovered waste items. This wraps up our series with BFFP members. Next, we take a look at the pros and cons of plastic credits. We'll be moving to short-form interviews that focus on solutions to the plastic crisis, including the Global Plastics Treaty. So it'll be a little bit shorter episodes and a quicker listen. Thanks so much for listening.